November 1st, 1944, Saipan, Mariana Islands, 602 hours. The air smelled of aviation fuel and salt spray. The particular perfume of American naval power projected across 6,000 miles of Pacific Ocean. Captain Robert Morgan stood on the tarmac of Islay Field, watching the sun break over the eastern horizon, painting the bellies of 88 B-29 Superfortresses in shades of gold and crimson. These were not ordinary bombers. Each aircraft stretched 99 feet from nose to tail, weighed 70 tons fully loaded, and represented the most ambitious aviation project in human history. More expensive than the Manhattan Project, more complex than any weapon system ever conceived. Behind Morgan, ground crews performed final checks on engines that could push these aluminum giants to 33,000 feet, higher than any Japanese fighter could effectively intercept, higher than most anti-aircraft fire could reach. The target today was Tokyo, not the outskirts, not the industrial zones on the periphery. Tokyo itself, the heart of the Empire of Japan, the city where Emperor Hirohito resided, the sacred space that no foreign weapon had touched in the 2,600 years of Japanese recorded history. And Morgan, along with 87 other aircraft commanders, had been told something that seemed impossible. They would bomb the Japanese capital and return without loss. The engines began their startup sequence, each 18-cylinder Wright Cyclone roaring to life with a sound like controlled thunder, multiplied across 352 engines. The propellers, 4 per aircraft, each 16 feet in diameter, bit into the humid morning air. Morgan climbed through the forward hatch of his aircraft, designated Jolton Josie, the Pacific Pioneer, and settled into the left seat of the cockpit. Through the greenhouse glass nose, he could see the entire flight line, an aerial armada that represented American industrial might distilled into its purest form. Each B-29 had cost $639,000 to build, more than 6 times the price of a B-17, more than most destroyer escorts. The 88 aircraft on this mission represented over $56 million in hardware alone, not counting the years of development, the redesigned factories, the training programs, the logistical infrastructure required to base them on this coral island 7,000 miles from California. This was not war as the Japanese understood it. Intimate, spiritual, fought by warriors imbued with Bushido. This was war as industrial process, as mass production, as the systematic application of overwhelming material superiority. And today, the Japanese would learn what that meant. No one on Saipan, watching those bombers taxi toward the runway in the golden light of dawn, could have fully grasped the psychological earthquake about to strike Japan. That in 9 hours, when these aircraft appeared over Tokyo, flying in formation at altitudes the Japanese believed unreachable, the fundamental assumption underlying Japanese military strategy would shatter. That the sacred homeland, protected by divine winds and the spirits of ancestors, would prove as vulnerable as Manila or Singapore or any other conquered city. That the psychological distance between the front lines and the home islands, the buffer that allowed Japanese civilians to believe in ultimate victory, even as their armies bled in New Guinea and Burma, would collapse in a single afternoon, November 1st, 1944. The day invincibility became a memory, and the Imperial Palace learned what terror felt like from 30,000 feet. To understand the magnitude of what was about to occur, one must first understand what Japan believed about its geographical invulnerability and what the B-29 represented, as a weapon system that defied every assumption of physics and strategy that had governed aerial warfare until 1944. Since the opening of hostilities in December 1941, Japan's home islands had experienced exactly one enemy air raid, Doolittle's audacious carrier-launched strike in April 1942, which had bombed Tokyo with 16 B-25 medium bombers flying at low altitude. The raid had achieved total tactical surprise and negligible strategic damage, but its psychological impact had been profound in both capitals. For Japan, it represented humiliation, proof that the sacred homeland could be violated. For America, it represented promise, proof that Japan was not beyond reach. But Doolittle's raiders had faced a cruel arithmetic problem. The B-25s had insufficient range to return to their carrier, forcing the crews to crash land in China. One-way missions could not win wars. What America needed was a bomber that could strike Japan from safe bases and return. What America needed was the B-29. The development of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress had begun in 1939, before Pearl Harbor, before America was even at war, based on the prescient understanding that future conflicts would require intercontinental reach. The Army Air Corps had issued a specification that seemed to violate the laws of physics. A bomber capable of carrying a 10,000-pound bomb load for 5,000 miles at speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour, at altitudes above 30,000 feet, with defensive armament sufficient to fight off interceptors. Every aviation engineer consulted had said it was impossible. Boeing had built it anyway. The result was an aircraft so advanced that it made every other bomber in the world obsolete the moment it flew. Pressurized cabin, so the crew could operate at extreme altitude without oxygen masks. Remote-controlled gun turrets, so firepower could be concentrated by computer rather than by individual gunners. 4 engines producing 2,200 horsepower each, more total power than 30. B-17s, a wing loading, so efficient that it could cruise at altitudes where the air was too thin for conventional fighters to maneuver effectively. But the B-29's development had been plagued by catastrophic problems. The engines overheated. The magnesium components caught fire. Test pilots died. On February 18, 1943, the second prototype had experienced an engine fire shortly after takeoff from Boeing Field in Seattle. The fire spread. The aircraft crashed into a meatpacking plant, killing the entire crew plus 19 workers on the ground, including Boeing's chief test pilot Eddie Allen, the finest aviator in the company. The crash investigation revealed fundamental design flaws. The engine cowling trapped heat. The fire suppression system was inadequate. The high-altitude performance created stresses that existing materials could barely withstand. Less determined nations would have canceled the program. America had doubled the budget and accelerated production. By mid-1944, Boeing was producing 350 B-29s per month from factories in Wichita, Renton, and Marietta. The aircraft that killed Eddie Allen had been redesigned, re-engineered, and mass-produced before his funeral flowers had wilted. This was the American way of war that Japan could not comprehend. Not incremental improvement, but revolutionary transformation. Not craftsmanship, but mass production. Not accepting limitations, but rewriting them through industrial brute force. Japanese aviation development followed a different philosophy. The Zero fighter, magnificent in 1941, was essentially unchanged in 1944 because Japanese industry lacked the capacity to design, test, and mass-produce new models while simultaneously maintaining frontline strength. Japanese bombers like the Betty had impressive range, but no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no capacity to absorb damage, because Japanese doctrine assumed that spiritual strength and tactical skill would prevent hits. The idea of building a bomber so large and complex that it cost more than 6 zeros, then building thousands of them, was economically and philosophically incomprehensible to Japanese military planners. When Japanese intelligence first received reports about the B-29 in early 1944, the initial assessment was that American propaganda had exaggerated its capabilities. A bomber with a 40-foot wingspan, correction, a 40-meter wingspan, no, that couldn't be right. The report said 141 feet wingspan. That was impossible. That was larger than the Kawanishi H-8K flying boat, larger than anything that could operate from a land runway. The reported service ceiling of 33,000 feet was dismissed as obvious misinformation. At that altitude, the air was so thin that engines lost power. Controls became sluggish. Human crews couldn't function without elaborate oxygen systems. The range figures were clearly fantasy. 2,800 miles combat radius with full bomb load. Japanese bombers could barely manage half that. The Intelligence Bureau of the Imperial General Staff issued a bulletin in March 1944 classifying B-29 reports as exaggerated claims intended to support American morale, and concluded that while the Americans may have developed a heavy bomber with moderately improved performance, it poses no immediate threat to the homeland. The bulletin estimated that if such an aircraft existed, it would require bases within 1,500 miles of Japan to be effective, and the American advance across the Pacific had not yet reached those positions. This was the same failure of imagination that had led Japan to believe Pearl Harbor would force American surrender, that the Zero's early dominance would remain permanent, that superior spirit could overcome material disadvantage. Japanese strategic thinking was trapped in a framework where warfare was conducted by warriors using weapons, where individual skill and morale were decisive factors. The American framework treated warfare as industrial output, where the skill of individual workers in Detroit or Seattle was expressed not in personal combat, but in the specifications of the machines they produced. A mediocre pilot in an excellent aircraft would defeat an excellent pilot in a mediocre aircraft. This was the American assumption, and they built their military around it. Not better men, better machines. So many better machines that individual quality became irrelevant beneath the weight of quantity. By June 1944, the Americans had captured Saipan in the Mariana Islands, and Japanese intelligence could no longer dismiss B-29 reports as fantasy because the aircraft were now based 1,200 miles from Tokyo. But Japanese strategic assessment remained rooted in their own operational experience. American bombers would come in at medium altitude, 20,000 feet or less, where Japanese fighters could intercept effectively and anti-aircraft fire could create effective barrage zones. Japanese High Command deployed 2 fighter wings to the Tokyo area, approximately 200 aircraft, a mix of Kai-44 Tojos, Kai-61 Tonis, and the new Kai-84 Franks that could reach 25,000 feet. They installed hundreds of additional anti-aircraft guns in concentric rings around the capital. They developed intercept doctrines based on early warning from coastal observation posts and radar stations. They drilled civilian air defense procedures. All of this preparation was predicated on the assumption that the Americans would fight. The kind of air war that everyone had fought since Doohay's theories in the 1920s. Bombers at medium altitude trading accuracy for survival. Defenders using altitude advantage and numbers to inflict maximum casualties. What the Japanese could not imagine, because no one had ever done it before, was that the Americans would simply fly above the fight. That the B-29s would cruise at 30,000 feet, where the air was so cold it froze moisture in the bomb. Bays, where the lack of oxygen would kill an unprotected human in minutes, where Japanese fighters gasped for power and anti-aircraft shells lost velocity and detonated harmlessly below the formations. The entire defensive scheme the Japanese had built assumed attackers would play by the established rules. The B-29 was designed to ignore the rules entirely. Captain Morgan, settling into his seat that November morning, understood this conceptually, but had not yet experienced it viscerally. The sheer psychological power of flying over an enemy capital in broad daylight, completely immune to their defenses, dropping bombs with the casual confidence of a training mission. He had flown B-17s over Germany, where every mission was survival roulette, where flak filled the sky and Luftwaffe fighters came in waves, where crews celebrated not successful missions, but any mission where they returned alive. the intelligence. Briefing the previous night had told them Tokyo would be different. The Japanese lacked the radar-directed flak that made German skies so deadly. Japanese fighters had limited high-altitude performance. The route had been planned to avoid the heaviest defenses. Expected losses: 0 to 2 aircraft. When the intelligence officer said that 0 to 2, there had been stunned silence in the briefing room. In the European theater, raids into Germany routinely lost 5 to 10% of attacking forces. The Schweinfurt raid in October 1943 had lost 77 out of 291 bombers, 26% casualties in a single mission. And now they were being told that a raid on the enemy capital might lose no one? The first B-29 rolled down the runway at 06:36 hours. The heavily loaded bomber used nearly every foot of Isley Field's 7,000 feet of coral runway before rotation, the nose lifting, the main gear following, the massive aircraft clawing its way into the tropical sky with the grace of a freight train learning to fly. Morgan watched 17 bombers take off ahead of his position, then received the green light. He pushed the throttles forward. The 4 Wright Cyclones responded with 8,800 combined horsepower. Jolton Josie accelerated, 70 tons of aircraft, and bombs and fuel and men picking up speed until the controls went light in his hands and the Pacific dropped away below. He retracted the gear and began the long climb to altitude. Around him, the formation assembled, 88 bombers in a loose procession, each aircraft climbing independently to conserve fuel, the plan calling for them to converge at 30,000 feet as they approached the Japanese coast. The flight to Japan took 6 hours. 6 hours over empty Pacific. The ocean below a featureless blue expanse broken only occasionally by the white wake of a submarine or the scattered wreckage of war. Morgan had time to think about the mathematics of what they were doing. Each B-29 carried a crew of 11 men. 88 aircraft meant 968 American lives in the air simultaneously, plus the hundreds of millions of dollars in equipment, plus the fuel. Each aircraft carrying 7,000 gallons, plus the IFAM bombs, plus the years of training, plus the industrial infrastructure that had built the aircraft and trained the crews and established the base and created the logistical network to keep them flying. This single mission represented more concentrated American investment than some entire campaigns in previous wars, and it was one mission of what would become hundreds. This was American abundance weaponized, not doing more with less, but doing more with overwhelmingly, absurdly, impossibly more. At 12:15 hours, the radio operator intercepted Japanese military broadcasts. The coastal observation posts had spotted the formation. Air raid warnings were sounding across Tokyo. Morgan could imagine the scene below. Civilians rushing to shelters. Fighter pilots running to their aircraft. Anti-aircraft crews training their guns skyward. The entire home front preparing for its first meaningful test since Doolittle 2.5 years ago. But the Japanese had no meaningful experience with high-altitude bombardment. German civilians knew to seek deep basements because they had learned through bitter experience that shelter depth correlated with survival. British civilians had learned the same during the Blitz. Japanese civilians had been told that their islands were protected, that American bombers couldn't reach them, that the war was something happening elsewhere. The air raid procedures were theoretical, untested. The shelters were inadequate. The entire psychological framework was unprepared for what was about to happen. At 13:18 hours, the Japanese coastline appeared on the horizon, a thin line of land emerging from the ocean's curve. Morgan checked his instruments. Altitude: 32,000 feet. Airspeed: 220 knots. Fuel: sufficient for the target run and return with reserves. Outside temperature: minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit. He could see other B-29s in the formation now, silver aircraft against blue sky, contrails streaming behind them like white ribbons marking their passage. The bombardier called out initial point identification. The bomb run began. Morgan steadied the aircraft, making small corrections as the bombardier aligned the Norden bomb site. Below, Tokyo spread across the Kanto Plain, the largest city in Asia, home to 7 million people, the political and spiritual center of the Japanese Empire. From 6 miles up, it looked peaceful. Geometric patterns of streets, the green rectangle of the Imperial Palace grounds, the silver thread of the Sumida River. No indication of the chaos that must be occurring down there. Fighters scrambling, guns tracking, observers calling out altitude, and heading information that made no sense because no bomber had ever attacked from this height. The Japanese fighters came, as expected. Morgan could see them climbing, small specks against the landscape below, contrails marking their ascent. They were trying. That was the terrible part. They were trying with everything they had. Ki-44 Tojos pushed their engines to maximum power, climbing through 20,000 feet, 25,000, straining for altitude while their pilots gasped in thin air because Japanese fighters lacked cockpit pressurization. Some reached 28,000 feet. A handful of the newest Ki-84 Franks clawed their way to 30,000. But at that altitude, they were at absolute ceiling, barely controllable, engines starving for air, controls mushy and unresponsive. They couldn't maneuver. They couldn't maintain formation. They couldn't execute the coordinated attacks that might have disrupted the bomber formation. They could only watch as the Americans flew past, in perfect precision, untouchable, invulnerable, dropping their bombs with the methodical efficiency of men who knew they faced no meaningful opposition. One Japanese pilot, Flight Sergeant Saburo Sakai, an ace with 64 confirmed kills, a veteran of every major air battle from Pearl Harbor to the Marianas, would later write about this mission in his memoir. "We climbed until I thought my fighter would tear itself apart. The engine screamed. The wings shook. At 8,000 meters, I could see them above me. Silver bombers in perfect formation, flying straight and level as if on parade. I tried to climb higher, but the aircraft would not respond. The air was too thin. The controls were like pushing against mud. I watched them pass overhead, so close I could read the numbers on their tails, and there was nothing I could do. Nothing." The Americans flew over the Emperor's palace at an altitude we could not reach, dropped their bombs and turned for home as if they were on a training mission. I felt shame so profound I wept inside my oxygen mask. We were samurai with swords trying to strike at eagles in the sky. Sakai's testimony captures the emotional and tactical reality of what occurred over Tokyo that afternoon. The Japanese were not defeated by superior courage or better tactics. They were defeated by physics and engineering. The B-29 simply operated in a regime of flight that Japanese aircraft could not effectively contest. The anti-aircraft fire was even less effective. Shells that might have created deadly fragmentation patterns at 20,000 feet detonated far below the bomber's stream, dangerous only to Japanese fighters that had ventured too high. The Americans flew through the scattered black puffs of AA fire as if through rain clouds. An inconvenience, not a threat. Morgan didn't even feel the aircraft shake from nearby bursts. They were too far away. The bombardier called bombs away at 13:24 hours. Morgan felt the aircraft lift slightly as 6 tons of high-explosive bombs tumbled from the bay. Through the bombardier's position, he could watch them fall, small black cylinders getting smaller, disappearing into the distance between aircraft and ground, falling for 45 seconds before impact. He didn't see the explosions. From this altitude, even a direct hit on a major building was barely visible. But the bombs were falling on the Musashino aircraft engine plant, one of the primary production facilities for the Nakajima Homare engines that powered Japanese fighters. The bombs would destroy machine tools that couldn't be replaced, kill skilled workers whose expertise took years to develop, set back production schedules by months. Strategic bombing wasn't about the drama of individual explosions. It was about the cumulative degradation of an enemy's capacity to wage war. One factory today, another tomorrow. Week after week, month after month, the systematic dismantling of industrial capability. The formation turned for home. Behind them, Tokyo burned in isolated fires where bombs had struck. But there was no general conflagration, no firestorm. The mission had been precision targeting against industrial facilities, and from 30,000 feet, precision was relative. Many bombs had missed their targets, falling in residential areas or empty ground. But that was acceptable in the calculus of strategic bombing. Even misses created terror, disrupted production, forced the enemy to divert resources to air defense. The primary objective had been achieved. American bombers had struck Tokyo in daylight, pressed their attack to completion, and were now withdrawing with every aircraft intact. The return flight lasted 7 hours. 7 hours of tense vigilance as fuel supplies dwindled, as engines were nursed to maintain optimal efficiency, as navigators calculated winds and made course corrections to ensure they found Saipan in the vast Pacific. But there was also a growing sense of astonishment. They had done it. They had bombed Tokyo, not hit and run like Doolittle, but a sustained strike with 88 heavy bombers, and every aircraft was returning. At 20:45 hours, the first B-29 touched down at Easley Field. One by one, the others followed, landing in the tropical darkness guided by runway lights and approach radars. 88 aircraft had departed. 88 returned. 0 losses. 0. The ground crews who had watched them depart that morning in golden light now watched them return in darkness, and the cheering began. Not the polite applause of a successful mission, but the raw celebration of men who understood they had witnessed something unprecedented. In the entire history of strategic bombing to that date, no major raid on a heavily defended enemy capital had ever returned without losses. Ever. The RAF's night raids on Berlin routinely lost 5% of attacking forces. American daylight raids on Germany lost even more. But Tokyo? 0. The maintenance crews swarmed the aircraft, examining them for battle damage, finding almost nothing. A few small holes from distant shell fragments. Nothing structural, nothing that couldn't be patched in an hour. It was as if the aircraft had flown to an undefended target range rather than the heart of enemy territory. Captain Morgan climbed down from Jolton Josie and stood on the tarmac, watching his crew disembark, watching other crews emerge from their aircraft, all wearing the same expression of disbelief. The intelligence officer who met them for debriefing asked about enemy opposition. Morgan struggled to find words. "There wasn't any," he said finally. "I mean, they tried. We could see fighters climbing toward us. We could see flak bursts, but they couldn't reach us. It was like we were in a different world up there, and they couldn't touch us." The intelligence officer made notes, but Morgan could see the man didn't fully understand. You had to be there. You had to watch Japanese fighters straining for altitude far below your formation. You had to see the anti-aircraft shells detonating harmlessly thousands of feet beneath your aircraft. You had to experience the surreal disconnect between the violence of the enemy's intent and the complete impotence of their execution. The Japanese were trying to kill them. They simply couldn't. The technology gap was too vast. In Tokyo, the psychological impact was seismic. The Japanese government-controlled press couldn't suppress what 7 million people had witnessed. American bombers flying over the capital in broad daylight, dropping bombs at will, then departing unscathed. The official communiqué issued by Imperial General Headquarters claimed heavy damage inflicted on enemy bomber formation and reported 17 confirmed shootdowns with 13 probable. These were lies, and on some level, Everyone knew they were lies. Japanese fighter pilots knew how many kills they had actually achieved. 0. Anti-aircraft crews knew their shells had fallen short. Civilian observers had watched the bombers fly away in perfect formation, undiminished. The gap between official narrative and witnessed reality created cognitive dissonance that no amount of propaganda could bridge. Private diaries and letters from Tokyo residents that survived the war provide haunting testimony to the psychological earthquake. Yoshiko Hashimoto, a teacher in Ueno District, wrote in her diary on November 1st. The air raid sirens began at noon. We took the children to the shelter as practiced. But the bombs fell far away. We heard only distant thunder. When we emerged, people were standing in the streets looking at the sky. Someone said the American bombers had flown over the palace. Over the palace! I felt cold despite the sun. If they can fly over the emperor's home, what place is safe? The radio says we shot down many of them. But I saw the silver planes in the sky, flying in formation like a flock of geese. They did not look damaged. They did not look afraid. They looked like they owned the sky. Hashimoto's observation, "They looked like they owned the sky," captured the essential terror of the B-29 raids. Air supremacy was not just a tactical condition, but a psychological one. The Japanese had built their entire war strategy on the assumption that the home islands constituted a secure rear area, protected by distance and by the defensive perimeter established across the Pacific. Citizens had been told that while the war news from distant fronts might be disappointing, Japan itself remained inviolate. The November 1st raid shattered that illusion. If American bombers could reach Tokyo unopposed, then nowhere was safe. The factories could be destroyed. The cities could be burned. The infrastructure that sustained the war effort could be systematically dismantled. And there was nothing that Japanese defenses could do to prevent it. The Japanese military understood the implications even more clearly than civilians. A classified assessment prepared by the Air Defense Command on November 3, 1944, concluded, "The American B-29 bomber operates at altitudes beyond the effective ceiling of our current fighter aircraft. Our anti-aircraft artillery cannot reach them. Radar detection provides early warning, but does not enable effective interception. The enemy can bomb strategic targets with relative impunity. Recommended actions: emergency development of high altitude, interceptors, deployment of additional anti-aircraft batteries with improved elevation capabilities, consideration of night operations to force enemy bombers to lower altitudes. However, even with maximum effort, significant improvement in defensive capabilities unlikely before spring 1945. Until then, we must accept that American bombers will operate over the homeland with minimal losses." This assessment represented total defensive failure. In the span of a single mission, Japan's entire air defense network had been rendered obsolete. The fighters, the guns, the training, the doctrine, all designed to fight a war at 20,000 feet, were useless against an enemy that fought at 30,000. And the technological gap was not something that could be closed through determination or sacrifice. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to design, test, and mass-produce high-altitude interceptors. The materials required, high-grade aluminum, advanced engine components, sophisticated oxygen systems, were already in critical shortage. Japanese factories were struggling to maintain current production levels of existing designs. Revolutionary new aircraft were impossible. The Japanese were trapped in a strategic checkmate. They couldn't stop the B-29s, and the B-29s would systematically destroy the industrial capacity that might, in theory, enable development of weapons that could stop them. The subsequent missions confirmed the pattern established on November 1st. B-29s struck Tokyo again on November 27th, losing one aircraft to mechanical failure, not to enemy action, but to engine trouble. A raid on December 3rd lost 2 aircraft, again to mechanical issues rather than Japanese defenses. The pattern was consistent and terrifying. American bombers could attack Tokyo with expected losses under 2%, nearly all from operational accidents rather than enemy action. For context, the Japanese Navy had considered the Pearl Harbor operation acceptable with expected losses of 30%. Bomber raids over Germany experienced actual losses of 5 to 10% and were considered sustainable. But the B-29s over Japan? Less than 2%, most not from combat. It wasn't warfare. It was industrial demolition conducted from the stratosphere. Japanese fighter tactics evolved in desperate attempts to counter the threat. Some pilots tried ramming attacks, diving from altitude to build speed, and attempting to crash into B-29s. A tactic that sometimes worked, but killed the attacking pilot, and only occasionally destroyed a bomber. Japanese command began concentrating all available fighters for massed attacks, hoping that even with degraded performance at high altitude, sheer numbers might overwhelm the B-29's defensive guns. These tactics achieved marginal success. Losses inched up from 2% toward 4%, but nothing that would make the raids unsustainable. For every B-29 destroyed, Boeing was producing 10 more. For every Japanese pilot killed in a ramming attack, the training pipeline couldn't produce adequate replacements. The exchange rate was devastating to Japan. By January 1945, the B-29 campaign had expanded beyond precision strikes on industrial targets to systematic destruction of Japanese urban areas. Major General Curtis LeMay, taking command of the strategic bombing effort, shifted tactics from high-altitude precision bombing to low-altitude incendiary attacks. The B-29s would come at night, at lower altitudes where accuracy improved, and Japanese fighters had better performance. But even these raids were sustainable because Japanese night fighters lacked effective radar, and the sheer number of attackers overwhelmed defenses. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9–10, 1945, killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night, more than either atomic bomb would kill, and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. Even in this lower-altitude regime, B-29 losses remained acceptable. The Americans had so many aircraft, so many crews, so much industrial capacity that they could sustain operations indefinitely. The symbolic weight of the B-29 in Japanese consciousness cannot be overstated. The aircraft became known as B-san, ADE, darkly sardonic title mixing respect and terror, the way medieval populations might have named the plague. When B-san came, you ran for shelter and prayed. Children learned to distinguish the sound of a B-29's engines from all other aircraft. A deep, droning hum multiplied across hundreds of engines, a sound that meant death was falling from the sky. Japanese industry, already strained by naval blockade and resource shortages, began to collapse under the systematic destruction of factories and transportation networks. By summer 1945, Japanese war production had declined by 70% from peak levels. Aircraft production, which had reached 28,000 units in 1944, fell to barely 11,000 in 1945. The B-29s were not merely bombing Japan, they were erasing its capacity to continue fighting. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Japanese military doctrine had always emphasized spiritual strength, that superior morale and willingness to sacrifice could overcome material disadvantages. Soldiers were taught that death in battle was glorious, that surrender was unthinkable, that the divine spirit of Japan would ultimately prevail against materialistic enemies. But the B-29 raids demonstrated something that spiritual rhetoric couldn't answer. What use was willingness to die when the enemy could kill you from a distance you couldn't reach? Japanese fighter pilots threw themselves at B-29 formations with suicidal courage, and still the bombers came. night after night, systematically reducing Japanese cities to ash. The disconnect between what soldiers were taught to believe, that spirit conquers matter, and what they experienced, that matter delivered from sufficient distance conquers everything, created profound disillusionment. Lieutenant Yasuo Kuwahara, a Japanese fighter pilot who survived the war, wrote in his memoir about the psychological collapse. "We had been told that American pilots were weak, that they lacked our spiritual strength, that their love of luxury made them cowards who would break under pressure. But when I engaged the B-29 formations, I saw something different. I saw men who flew in perfect coordination, who maintained formation under attack, who operated their defensive guns with mechanical precision. They were not cowards. They were simply operating at a level of technological sophistication we could not match. Our Zeros were beautiful aircraft, responsive and agile, but they were made of aluminum and canvas, powered by engines we couldn't adequately maintain. The B-29s were fortresses of steel and advanced systems. When I attacked them, my 20mm cannon, shells would hit and seem to do nothing. The aircraft was so large that even direct hits barely affected it. Meanwhile, their defensive guns tracked me with radar assistance. It was not a fight. It was a demonstration of our inadequacy." Kuwahara's testimony reveals the core of Japanese military disillusionment. The samurai ethos, the Bushido tradition, the entire cultural framework that had sustained Japanese military spirit, all of it was predicated on the assumption that individual excellence and willingness to sacrifice mattered. But modern industrial warfare, as practiced by the United States, had made individual excellence nearly irrelevant. It didn't matter how skilled a Japanese pilot was when he flew an aircraft that couldn't reach the enemy's altitude. It didn't matter how brave a Japanese soldier was when American naval guns could bombard his position from beyond visual range. It didn't matter how determined Japanese workers were when American submarines blockaded the raw materials needed for production. Courage was not obsolete, but it was insufficient. And this realization, spreading through Japanese military and civilian populations in 1945, was more demoralizing than any battlefield defeat. The B-29, as a weapon system, represented American abundance in its most distilled form. Each aircraft required 90,000 pounds of aluminum, metal that Japan desperately hoarded and could never accumulate in such quantities. Each aircraft's production consumed 45,000 man-hours of skilled labor. The 4 engines alone cost more than an entire Zero fighter, and America built 3,970 of them between 1943 and 1945. Nearly 4,000 of the most advanced, expensive, complex aircraft ever designed, built while simultaneously producing tens of thousands of other aircraft types, millions of vehicles, thousands of ships, and all the ammunition and equipment to sustain global warfare across multiple theaters. The magnitude of American production was not just an economic fact, it was a philosophical statement. We can afford to build weapons so expensive that losing them is acceptable. We can afford casualties that would break other nations. We can afford to bomb you until you surrender, because we have more bombs than you have targets. Japanese strategic planning had never accounted for an enemy with this kind of industrial base. Japan's own war planning assumed rough parity in production capacity modified by Japanese advantages in training and morale. The strategy was to win quick, decisive victories, establish a defensive perimeter, and force America to accept a negotiated peace rather than pay the blood price to reconquer the Pacific. This strategy assumed America would make rational cost-benefit calculations. It did not anticipate that America would simply outproduce Japan by factors of 10 to 1 in most categories. That American industry would treat weapons production the way Detroit treated automobile production, as a problem of manufacturing efficiency and scale. By 1944, American shipyards were launching an aircraft carrier every month and a destroyer every 3 days. American aircraft factories were producing 96,000 aircraft per year, more than Japan's entire wartime production combined. The Japanese had brought knives to a gun factory. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese nation by radio for the first time in history, announcing surrender. His prepared statement cited a new and most cruel bomb that forced capitulation. The atomic weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the strategic reality was more complex. Japan was already defeated before the atomic bombs fell, defeated by the systematic destruction of its industrial base and merchant fleet, defeated by the starvation of resources that sustained its war machine. The B-29 raids had destroyed 178 square miles of Japanese cities, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, rendered millions homeless, and eliminated Japan's capacity to sustain modern warfare. The atomic bombs were punctuation marks on a paragraph already written by conventional strategic bombing. They provided a face-saving rationale for surrender. We were defeated by a terrifying new weapon, not by simple material inferiority. But the underlying truth was more humbling. Japan had been defeated by American production capacity, translated into overwhelming aerial bombardment. The B-29 had done what blockades and island-hopping campaigns and naval battles had begun. It had proven that Japan could not win a war of attrition against American industry. Captain Morgan, who flew that first mission over Tokyo on November 1, 1944, completed 23 combat missions before the war ended. He returned to America in October 1945, traded his captain's bars for civilian life, and like millions of veterans, tried to process what he had experienced. In a 1983 interview for an Air Force historical project, Morgan reflected on the Tokyo raids. "We knew we were doing something unprecedented. Every mission briefing, they'd tell us expected losses, and every time it was under 2%. In Europe, I'd flown missions where we lost a quarter of the formation. But over Japan, we just kept coming back. All of us. It got to the point where it felt routine. Bomb Tokyo, fly home, do it again next week. I think that was the real weapon. More than the bombs themselves. We could keep doing it indefinitely. The Japanese had to know that. They had to understand they couldn't stop us. That we would just keep coming until there was nothing left to bomb. That's not warfare as romance, as combat between heroes. That's industrial process. We were factory workers whose product was destruction, and we had infinite inventory." Morgan's description, factory workers whose product was destruction, captures the essence of American strategic bombing doctrine. It was not about individual heroism or tactical brilliance. It was about systematic application of superior resources. The United States had built a military-industrial complex capable of producing weapons in quantities that made losses acceptable and victory inevitable through attrition. This was profoundly democratic in its way. Not aristocratic warrior castes with superior training, but average citizens with superior equipment. The B-29 crews were overwhelmingly not professional military men, but drafted civilians, college students, and mechanics, and farmers trained to operate complex machines and then sent to do a job. They didn't need to be exceptional. They just needed to be competent and numerous. The machines would provide the margin of victory. For Japan, the lesson was equally clear, but infinitely more bitter. The empire had gambled that spiritual strength and tactical skill could overcome material disadvantages, that early victories would create strategic advantages, that America's democratic society would lack the will to sustain long campaigns. All three assumptions had proven catastrophically wrong. American society, precisely because it was democratic and industrial, had proven capable of mobilizing resources on a scale that made Japanese wartime production look trivial. The B-29, that impossibly large, impossibly expensive, impossibly capable weapon, had been produced in quantities that Japan couldn't match if it had converted every factory in the home islands to aircraft production. The Americans had overwhelmed. Japanese defenses not through clever tactics, but through brute application of industrial superiority. Numbers. Physics. The cold arithmetic of production capacity. The sun set over Saipan on countless evenings in late 1944 and early 1945, painting the sky in gold and crimson as it had on that first morning when 88 superfortresses had taxied toward destiny. The missions became routine as aerial combat could ever be, but the strategic impact accumulated with mathematical inevitability. Every raid destroyed factories that couldn't be rebuilt. Every incendiary attack burned neighborhoods that couldn't be restored. Every loss of skilled workers was an irreplaceable drain on Japanese capacity. The B-29s were not fighting a war. They were executing an industrial program of strategic demolition, and the only meaningful variable was time. How long until Japanese infrastructure collapsed completely? On Saipan, ground crews serviced the bombers with the systematic efficiency of mechanics at an assembly plant. Armorers loaded bombs. Fuel trucks topped off tanks. Maintenance teams replaced worn components with the casual expertise of men who had performed the same tasks hundreds of times. The aircraft themselves became familiar. Joltin Josie, Enola Gay, Boxcar, names that personalized machines but didn't change their essential nature as industrial weapons built to specification and operated according to doctrine. Each mission was not a heroic adventure, but a scheduled operation, as predictable as a train timetable. This was the American advantage distilled. We will bomb you tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, and there is nothing you can do to stop us, because we have built an unstoppable machine. Japanese survivors of the strategic bombing campaign carry memories that even 80 years later retain traumatic immediacy. The sound of air raid sirens, the drone of hundreds of engines overhead, the heat of incendiary bombs that turned entire neighborhoods into infernos, the morning after landscapes of ash and twisted metal where cities had stood. But perhaps most traumatic was the helplessness. The knowledge that the bombers would come again, that shelters were inadequate, that defenses were meaningless, that American abundance had manifested as an aerial death machine that could not be reasoned with or defeated or even effectively resisted. This was not war as samurai tradition imagined it, a contest between worthy opponents where courage and skill determined outcomes. This was industrial slaughter, impersonal and relentless, conducted from altitudes where the bombers appeared as silver specks in the sky, untouchable and inevitable. The Imperial Palace in Tokyo, traditionally protected by spiritual sanctions and physical security, learned to live in the shadow of American bombers that could, but chose not to, destroy it at will. The decision not to bomb the palace was tactical. American planners believed the emperor would be necessary for surrender negotiations, that destroying him might make Japanese resistance fanatical and eternal. But the Japanese understood the subtext. The Americans could have killed the emperor any afternoon they chose. They had the capability. They showed restraint not from fear but from strategic calculation. Even divine emperors survived at American sufferance. This was perhaps the most profound psychological defeat. The realization that Japan's sacred institutions persisted not because they were inviolable, but because the enemy had decided, for its own reasons, to allow them to continue temporarily. The November 4, 1944, raid, that first mission where 88 B-29s bombed Tokyo and all returned safely, marked the moment when the mythology of Japanese security collapsed. Before that date, civilians could still believe that the homeland was protected, that the war was something happening elsewhere, that ultimate victory remained possible. After that date, belief required willful denial of what the sky demonstrated every few days. American bombers flying in formation at impossible altitudes, dropping their loads, departing unscathed. The mathematics were inescapable. If this could continue, and clearly it could continue indefinitely, Then Japan would be reduced to ash and starvation. No amount of courage could prevent it. No tactical brilliance could counter it. Only surrender or annihilation remained. In the final analysis, the B-29 campaign was not about individual missions or specific targets. It was about demonstrating the futility of resistance against an enemy with overwhelming industrial capacity. Every raid reinforced the message: we can reach you, we can hurt you, and you cannot stop us. The Japanese had begun the war with surprise attacks on unprepared enemies, achieving swift victories against opponents who underestimated Japanese capability and determination. The irony was perfect and bitter. Japan ended the war being bombed by an enemy whose industrial capability Japan had catastrophically underestimated, whose determination to see the war through to total victory Japan had fatally misjudged. The B-29 was the instrument of that reversal, the weapon that brought terror home to a nation that had believed itself protected by divine providence and geographic isolation. Captain Morgan, standing on the tarmac at Islay Field in November 1945 as the war wound down, watched the superfortresses being prepared for return flights to America or scrapping. Some would fly home. Most would be disassembled, their advanced components salvaged, their airframes cut up for scrap metal. They had served their purpose. The war was won. The aircraft that had been impossible in 1939 and essential in 1944 would be obsolete by 1950, replaced by jet bombers with even greater range and capability. But in their moment, the B-29s had been perfect instruments of American strategic doctrine, advanced enough to dominate the technological battlefield, producible in sufficient quantities to sustain continuous operations, and expensive enough to demonstrate that America could afford to wage war at a level of resource commitment that other nations couldn't imagine. The sun set over Saipan on November 1, 1945, exactly 1 year after that first raid on Tokyo. The bombers sat silent on their hard stands, their missions complete. Across 6,000 miles of ocean, in Japan, survivors rebuilt their cities from ash and rubble, carrying forward the memory of silver aircraft in the sky that nothing could touch, that brought fire and destruction with systematic inevitability. The war had taught many lessons, but perhaps the most fundamental was this: that modern warfare between industrial nations was not a contest of courage or tradition, but a competition of production capacity. That spiritual strength could not overcome material inferiority when that inferiority reached certain critical magnitudes. That weapons designed by engineers in Seattle and built by workers in Kansas could defeat warriors descended from samurai if those weapons were sufficiently advanced and sufficiently numerous. The B-29 flew above the fight, literally and metaphorically, above the desperation of Japanese pilots pushing their aircraft to structural limits, above the futility of anti-aircraft fire arcing skyward and falling short, above the ancient codes and martial traditions that had sustained Japanese military spirit. It flew in the realm of industrial supremacy, where physics and production capacity determined outcomes, where the nation with more aluminum and better engineers and larger factories simply built weapons that the enemy couldn't counter. This was democracy's way of war, not aristocratic champions with superior training, but adequate soldiers with superior tools, not brilliant tactics, but overwhelming force. Not winning through excellence, but through sufficiency, multiplied by crushing numerical advantage. And on that November morning in 1944, when 88 superfortresses returned to Saipan with every crew intact, with 0 losses, with proof that the impossible had become routine, on that morning, the Japanese learned what American abundance meant in practice. Not just more food or more cars or more consumer goods, but more weapons, more aircraft, more bombs, more of everything required to wage industrial warfare at a scale that made resistance mathematically futile. The silver bombers in the sky became symbols of that abundance, beautiful in their way, terrible in their implications, unstoppable because stopping them would have required rebuilding Japanese industry from the ground up with resources Japan did not have and time Japan did not possess. Contrails faded from the Tokyo sky that November afternoon, white ribbons dissipating into blue emptiness. But the lesson remained, written in the absence of losses and the presence of destruction. America had reached the Japanese homeland, bombed it at will, and returned unscathed. This would continue until surrender. The B-29 guaranteed it. The production lines in Kansas and Washington guaranteed it. The vast industrial economy that could build 4,000 of the world's most advanced bombers, while simultaneously fighting wars across the globe, guaranteed it. Not courage, not spirit, not divine protection. Just aluminum and engines and bombs, delivered from heights that made the defenders' courage irrelevant and their sacrifice meaningless. This was the terrible arithmetic of modern war between mismatched industrial powers. Not a fight, but an execution in slow motion, conducted with the methodical efficiency of factory production schedules. And Japan, watching the silver bombers disappear over the Pacific horizon, understood that no amount of determination could change the equation. The numbers had spoken. The sky had delivered the verdict. Surrender or annihilation. There was no third option when the enemy owned the heavens and could bomb you with impunity every day until the end of time.